and prestigious history of peaceful cooperation and great sports. But sadly, the Olympics also have their darker moments. For example, Munich in 1936, which was used by Hitler, or Moscow in 1984, which was used to legitimise the Soviets. We say, ladies and gentlemen, in a few years' time, China will become recognised as the same kind of games, the same kind of dark moments of the Olympic Games. But what we're going to show you on Team Proposition today is how this illuminated the stadium but darkened the brutality. What I want to look at in my speech is how it undermines the Olympic ideal, and secondly, how it undermines human rights. And what Ben's going to go on to look at later is how it legitimises China's brutality. But before I do that, let's be absolutely clear about what we mean when we say we regret these Olympics. We say we regret it because China were granted the Olympic Games based on the idea that they would improve their human rights as a result. That was the aim of giving them the Olympics. That was what the International Olympics Committee, or IOC, intended. But ladies and gentlemen, they haven't. And we're going to show you that we therefore regret it because they did not live up to what the intention was. But we're also going to show you we regret it because we feel that it made the situation worse. And those are the two things which we feel constitute why we regret. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at this issue of undermining the Olympic ideal. We say there are two things that are considered when you're giving out the Olympics, that the IOC considers. The first is whether or not you'll hold a good games. You say that's one of the criteria. But there's another one, and that's will you uphold the Olympic ideal. Now the Olympics are a great thing. They're a thing which involve countries coming together from all over the world to work in peace and cooperate through sports. We say, for example, that Russia took on America during the Cold War. So we recognise that sport is something that's very positive and that we should recognise as very hopeful. Go ahead.
And exactly, when nations work together, they strengthen their ties, they strengthen their diplomacy, and that helps us work towards a better future.
Okay, well what Ben's going to look at is how in reality this gives it an outward appearance of being very good. But in reality, instead of encouraging diplomacy and encouraging people to change by putting pressure on them, it actually eased the pressure off of China because it gave them an air of legitimacy. And that's exactly what Ben's point will focus on. So we say in reality it doesn't encourage diplomatic pressure, it took it off of China. But ladies and gentlemen, we say that the Olympics bring huge amounts of benefits because they're very, very big. For example, over 1 billion people watch them every time they're on. But in addition, because they're unique, there's something that only comes around every 4 years, and countries know that it's very important for them to have it, and it's something very important to look at. So ladies and gentlemen, we say these benefits range from the idea of economic benefits, such as having tourists coming, such as having sponsorship, such as having people, having your country broadcast across the world, and also from prestige, just simply from being shown across the world to be putting on these games. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that it is absolutely right and fair that in return for all these massive economic benefits, that the country that is given the responsibility of hosting these games must in turn uphold the Olympic ideal, which they are themselves supposed to be projecting. We say that in this case, that means that they must be positive with their human rights. We say they have to uphold human rights, to be upholding that Olympic ideal of being peaceful and cooperative and being a generally positive thing. And in this case, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm now going to look at is how they did not do that, and how in reality it undermines human rights. Now the IOC, as I've already mentioned, justified its decision to grant the Games to China based on the fact that its human rights would improve. They recognised that the human rights were not good in the first place, but they justified the fact that they were giving it to a country which did not have a good human rights record by saying that human rights record would improve. But ladies and gentlemen, it didn't. Go ahead.
So do you think it's so early to decide already now, 2 months right afterwards, saying that China made a huge difference and it hasn't?
Okay, well we say first of all, when they were granted the Games, that was about 8 years before the Games actually arrived. They had that entire time to improve their human rights record, and they haven't, which is what I'm going to look at in a second. But ladies and gentlemen, we also say the fact that they've already been given the Games and they've removed the bargaining chip, and again I'll analyse that in a second, means they now have absolutely no incentive to improve their human rights records in the future. So ladies and gentlemen, let me look at why it hasn't changed. Well, we say the fact is that when the Olympics were given to China, they were not given based on a provision of actually having to change their human rights. We didn't say to China, you can have the Games for 2008, but if you don't improve your human rights, instead of letting you host them in 2008, we'll give them to someone else. In reality, ladies and gentlemen, that didn't happen. They gave the human rights, they gave the Olympic Games to China. And what that meant, ladies and gentlemen, is we lost our bargaining chip. We could no longer say to China, improve your human rights, or else we won't give you the games, because we'd already given them the games, ladies and gentlemen. We lost our ability to look at them and to address this problem, and we lost the incentive for change, which is why they are unlikely to change in the future, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at exactly what didn't change. Well, the fact is, free speech was still prevented. For example, despite the fact that the Chinese created Protest Square, which was supposed to be something which would enable its freedom of expression, we say no protests were actually allowed to happen there. For example, there were over 70 requests for protests to be held there. The Chinese government put a lot of pressure on people who requested to make protests. A lot of those people subsequently withdrew their applications. And of the ones that actually continued to apply, the rest of those were rejected. Similarly, they didn't allow any Tibetan, on the Tibetan part of the route, they did not allow any crowds to form because they did not want protests to occur, ladies and gentlemen. Except we still saw that same rejection of freedom of expression, which the games were intended to change. Similarly, there were still problems with things like huge amounts of executions, with huge numbers of political prisoners, with lots of use of live organ harvest. We say there were huge numbers of human rights abuses, which were supposed to change because of the Olympics, but which did not, ladies and gentlemen. And we regret giving it to China on the grounds that it did not do what it was supposed to do. But ladies and gentlemen, the Olympics actually made it worse. It's not just a case that it didn't improve things, but it did actually make it worse. Because it gave the Chinese an incentive to do a lot of different human rights abuses. For example, in the Xinjiang province, which has a large number of Uyghur Muslims, we say actually what the Chinese did was they argued that the Olympics would be a massive terrorist threat, and they used the Olympics as an excuse to round up a lot of Uyghur Muslims. We say that was a human rights abuse, ladies and gentlemen, which would happen directly because the Olympics were awarded to China. Similarly, they used it as an excuse to bulldoze houses in Beijing. They did that in order to create space for Olympic sites. They did it without compensating the people fairly, and they did it without people's permission. They simply bulldozed huge numbers of people's houses. There are families today, ladies and gentlemen, that were left homeless because people just bulldozed their houses, took over their land, and built there, ladies and gentlemen. That's what the Olympics encouraged China to do. They also removed the freedom of choice of people to make decisions. So, for example, they looked at an ugly house, they boarded it up in Beijing because they didn't want to project that image. They told people in Beijing what they should wear, what they should say, so that they would seem like good citizens of China, people that China wanted you to see. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we say this is simply wrong, because what we say is that we reject these Olympics. We say that they were not within the Olympic ideal. And what they did, not only did they not change human rights abuses, which was what they were supposed to do, but they actually made them worse, ladies and gentlemen. So I urge you to propose peace.
The Olympic Games in Beijing was the first crack in the bamboo curtain. The Olympic Games have opened the door and begun a process through which we firmly believe, and we believe that the world stands with us on this, that China will improve. Now the proposition got up here and said, well, the Olympics have happened and China isn't perfect yet. And we say, of course they will. But that's a rather simplistic way to look at it. Because the attempt to reform an entire nation with decades, perhaps even hundreds of years of history of human rights abuse is something that takes time. And we believe that the Olympics was a crucial step down this road. Now, we're going to be explaining to you throughout our case why we do not regret the Beijing Olympics, because we firmly believe that the Olympics did more good than it did harm. And the harm that did come about as a result of the Olympics were not dependent on the Olympics, and these harms would have occurred regardless. We'll be doing this through 3 levels of analysis. We'll be explaining to you why the Olympics did more good than harm to the Chinese people, both on the level of their human rights and on the level of their economic situation. We'll be showing you why it benefited the international community on the level of strengthening and expanding relations with China. And finally, we'll be discussing the Olympics themselves and the ideals of sport. But before we go on to do that, I'd first like to address what we've heard so far from the proposition. Now, as I said, their main problem with the Beijing Olympics, and the reason they regret them, is because they didn't bring about the end of human rights abuses in China. And we say, of course, ladies and gentlemen, but it's not that easy. And the Olympics were just the first step. So now to deal with the specific points, no thank you, that they brought up so far. Their first point was the Olympic ideal, and here they discussed the issue of legitimacy and the issue of upholding human rights. And we'd like to ask you, with regards to legitimacy, what legitimizes China's human rights abuses more? Is it standing at the side, refusing to interact, and saying, every now and then throwing out an occasional objection, which China ignores? Or is it stepping in? Is it interacting and engaging with China? No, thank you. Expanding our ability to negotiate and through that improve the situation of the people who are suffering. And on the issue of human rights, they attempted to make it seem like any nation with human rights is not allowed to participate, with human rights abuses, is not allowed to participate in the Olympics. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not the factor. We let Iran play, we let Sudan play, because we believe that the Olympics is an international community where we can't let, no thank you, certain political issues interfere with the activities. Now, with regards to the second issue they raised, about how the situation hasn't changed and therefore we regret the Olympics, we have three answers to this idea. First of all, there have been many improvements in China, which the proposition is ignoring, and I'll get to them in a moment in my constructive. They also said there are still many abuses that are occurring in China, such as organ harvesting. That was their example. And we say, yet again, that this is no connection to the Olympics, no thank you, and would recur regardless. Finally, they said that the Olympics made the situation worse, because we violated people's social freedoms and took away their houses. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, the world cried out when this happened. And I'll be going on about this in my point in a moment. All these things brought even greater awareness to China's situation than before. One moment. And also we say that China's policy is to act this way, and it would have happened anyway. Please.
American human rights protesters were protesting whilst their president was clapping in the front row of the opening ceremony.
All right, obviously, there's a certain level of international decorum that has to be approved. Would we have done any better if the president had just started ranting and saying, no, no, China is bad? Ladies and gentlemen, no, that's not how international politics works. That wouldn't have achieved anything. All right, moving on to the first level of analysis, which is regarding the Chinese people. Now, first of all, we'd like to talk about this issue of awareness to China's human rights issues. China does have many abuses occurring within their borders, and we'd like to stress that these issues have existed for decades and decades. The oppression in Tibet, the lack of social rights, etc., these are not new, and they are not dependent on the Olympics. They're completely independent. No, thank you. And for all the years that China has been doing these abuses, the world has stood by rather silently, and any objections that were raised, China ignored. Now, the decision to hold the Olympics in Beijing shone a spotlight onto China's human rights abuses. The media, various politicians around the world, such as the President of France, for example, international organizations, they all spoke out against China's human rights abuses, bringing awareness of the problem to a greater level than it had ever been before. The world got a crystal clear view of China's crimes, and an international outcry arose. And this led, ladies and gentlemen, to results. A few examples of these results were in response to the international pressure about the issue of Tibet, which was raised in the wake of the Olympics. Chinese officials, for the first time ever, agreed to meet with the Dalai Lama, ladies and gentlemen. Chinese officials agreed to begin a negotiation process which never before had even been discussed, ladies and gentlemen. And the meeting was put off because of the earthquake that struck China, but the process has begun. Also, we'd like to point out that China has drastically lowered the pollution levels in all of its cities. This was a direct result of the Olympics game being hosted there, and it benefited the citizens. Also, another direct effect was that China cleaned up its streets of drugs, of crime, of prostitution. Please.
Are you really comparing cleaning up some streets and stopping some cars driving to using the Olympics to justify the persecution of Uyghur Muslims?
Thank you. But the Olympics doesn't justify anything, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that China hosted the Olympics doesn't mean that we're now saying, all right, China, every single action you've ever done is fine. All we're doing is saying, you're a member of the international community like any other nation. We will deal with you, and we'll try to change the evil that you're doing, but we're not going to ignore you anymore. Also, we'd just like to point out that the Olympics brought billions and billions of dollars into the Chinese economy. This is an essential point that we cannot ignore, because all this money went directly to the citizens who needed it most. All the money that was spent through tourism, people going to restaurants, people buying food from street vendors, no thank you, all these hundreds of thousands of people who came to the Olympics, who worked in the Olympics, and all this money went straight to the citizens who really need this money, and it benefited them immensely. So we see no thank you, that on the level of the Chinese people, the Olympics did bring them direct benefit and began a process through which they will benefit even more. And that brings me to the second level of analysis, which is the benefit of the Olympics on an international level. And we state that the Olympics strengthened the world's relations with China. The Olympics brought about the development of the world's diplomatic ties with China. No, thank you. Now, in the past, China has been extremely reluctant to engage with the rest of the world on a diplomatic level. In the past, any motion that might have regarded Chinese interests that was raised in the Security Council was immediately vetoed by China. It was practically a knee-jerk reaction. No, thank you. But by allowing them to host the biggest and most important of international competitions, the world held out a hand to China and said, "Stop ignoring us. We can do some good if you allow us to work with you." And China was forced by this to open up on many levels. There was the diplomatic level in which China began to engage. A couple of examples exist with the fact that the Chinese and American embassies both opened up brand new facilities in each other's capitals, and huge celebrations were hosted in each. Chinese charter flights began between China and Taiwan, something that had never occurred before in history. And also, perhaps most importantly and most significantly, China allowed a motion condemning Sudan to pass in the Security Council. This was something that could not have been predicted and would have been unheard of before China became this accepted member of the international community. And ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, all these improvements are signs of the beginning of a process. The beginning of the first steps down a road in which China will become a responsible player within the international community. And we haven't solved the problem in one step, but we've started the process. Thank you very much.
Last night, ladies and gentlemen, I had an Olympic dream. I saw Usain Bolt dancing after he broke the 200-meter world record. I saw Michael Phelps diving dolphin-like into the pool to break his 8th world record. And I saw the joy as Afghanistan got its first Olympic medal. And then I woke up. And then I remembered about the 8,000 people executed in China last year. I remembered about the massacres of monks in Tibet. I remembered about the torture in Chinese secret prisons. And suddenly I thought, maybe, just maybe, we were a bit too nice to them, after all. Now, what my speech is going to deal with today is how not only have things not improved because we gave China the Olympics, as Emily showed you, but that we have actively legitimised China's brutality. And that is very dangerous. No thanks, guys. Because what we say, the Olympic torch we're carrying through our case on this side of the House, is that the Olympics may have illuminated the stadium, but they darkened the brutality. But before I talk about legitimacy, ladies and gentlemen, I want to look at what the first opposition speaker told us. Now, first of all, he said, well, we think it's the start of a process. We think that's kind of a cop-out, ladies and gentlemen. We haven't had any progress yet. We've already had, no thanks guys, 9 years. I'll come on to deal with your one example later. But we're starting a process. Well, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that as Emily showed you in her speech, the process could have been used a lot better if we had said, no, we're going to make this about incentives, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to try and push you in order to get to the Olympics, to change your human rights record. And then they dealt with all of our examples about things which hadn't changed, about organ harvesting, about execution, by going, it's not linked to the Olympics. Not at all. We think that's a bit of a tension. No, thank you, guys. What they're trying to claim is that this is a really important part of the process of improving Chinese human rights, apart from all the things that proposition wants to talk about. We're not going to stand up for that kind of illogicality, ladies and gentlemen. No thanks, guys. And then let's see what he told us about human rights and about progress. Now, their one example of progress, ladies and gentlemen, was a meeting which never actually happened. And they ignored the fact, no thanks guys, that their record is getting worse and worse all the time. But Amnesty is not saying, yeah, they're getting a lot better on the organ harvesting and the execution and the torture. No, no, no. They are getting worse every single day, ladies and gentlemen. No thanks guys. Then he said, well, there were loads of economic benefits, to which we say, yeah, and we don't really care. Ladies and gentlemen, the people of China are plenty prosperous at the moment. Their economy is growing fast and they're doing well. No thanks, guys. They don't need the dollars from the Olympics. They need their government to stop shooting them. And we think that's a bit more important, right? No thanks. And then lastly, we have this wonderful argument about the international community. Now, first of all, we think we could have done better. Like, we could have done diplomatic engagement better by using the incentive of, we will give you the Olympics eventually, down the road, if it's as good and as useful for your economy as you claim. No thanks, when you actually start improving your human rights record. And then he said, they allowed the Sudan to be condemned. Not for us to send peacekeepers there. Not for us to call what's going on in Darfur a genocide. No, thank you guys. They still protected Chinese interests in Burma and in Darfur really vigorously. But, you know, we're getting there. Because they allowed us to issue a condemnation. Not good enough, ladies and gentlemen.
Sir.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Alright, so you've said that China hasn't solved its human rights problem in a moment. But what we're telling you is that we need time.
Sorry? And we're saying, you've had time, you've had 9 years since they got awarded the bid, and they've got worse, ladies and gentlemen. But now let's talk about legitimising China's brutality. Because they tried to rebut this idea of China's brutality by saying, we've engaged with them, ladies and gentlemen. Before we just stood by idly, we say, no. Proposition is not in favour of standing by idly. Proposition is in favour of a fulsome condemnation, ladies and gentlemen, saying you are wrong, you are abhorrent, and you are not welcome in our international community. No, thank you, guys. But instead, what giving them the Olympics did was to associate with them, and by extension, to recognise them, and to respect them, and to acknowledge them as part of your community. No, thanks, Dutch. First of all, we say the act of giving it to them in and of itself confers respect on them as part of the international community. Secondly, more heads of state than ever before showed up to the opening ceremony in Beijing. Ladies and gentlemen, this wasn't just an ordinary Olympics. This was an Olympics where everybody came to party. And when Americans see George W. Bush jacket off, chilling out in the stands of the stadium, and Hu Jintao sitting in front of him whilst he's plotting the latest way he can put down Tibet. No, thank you, sir. We say that that tells everybody, it tells the Chinese and it tells the Americans that these people are fine. We say, first of all, that's wrong in and of itself. We don't want to give respect to these people. They don't deserve our respect. They deserve our condemnation. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, no, thank you, sir. We say they did a really good job. It was really impressive, ladies and gentlemen. As a citizen of London who's having to take the torch, like, I'm worried, right? They were really good. They may have had to use fake fireworks and to hide the ugly girl for the but it was a good opening ceremony. So now when people think about China, they don't think about human rights abuses. They think about what a cool opening ceremony did those guys put on for all of us, and we say that's a distraction. Go ahead, Benji.
Was it also a distraction when suddenly people cared about Tibet? When suddenly all the international, put on Tibet?
We think it's really nice for you to sit up here and, talk learnedly about how everybody's really worried about Tibet. But the fact is, 1.2 billion people watched the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. We don't think 1.2 billion people read the Time magazine article about human rights abuses in Tibet, ladies and gentlemen. For the vast majority of the global community, what mattered was that it was spectacular. What mattered was that it was really impressive. Now, why is it worse for human rights when we get distracted? We say, first of all, externally, because people have started to forget about the human rights abuses, because we've started to welcome them. We think that means that there is less Western pressure on their government to pressure the Chinese government, and through NGOs, through civil society, through the media, to pressure governments directly, to say to the Chinese government, we actually think you should do something about this. We think you should change. But we say internally, ladies and gentlemen, because George Bush pitched up to the opening ceremony, the people of China think that their leaders are welcome in the international community. They think that they are now accepted members of that community. The people of China are not sitting around going, but guys, please stop being brutal to us. They're congratulating their leaders for putting on a really good games, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that that firms up the Chinese government in its position. Ladies and gentlemen, the Olympics generated less outward pressure for change and less inward pressure for change. They affirmed China's brutal rulers in their tradition of oppression, and for that reason, we beg to propose.
I have two questions. questions after hearing the opening that Ben gave us about the horrors that happened in China. I have 2 questions for every single person in this room. The first is, before August 2008, did you know? Can anybody here honestly say, get up and say, we knew everything that was going on. We knew about the monks. We cared about the monks. We read about them in the Time magazine. Can you tell us the Time magazine actually wrote about today, before this happened? And the second question, after England can tell us that they knew about it before the Olympics, we have a question, what did you do? What did anyone here do? What did any government of the world do? Because what the proposition here are saying is that while there was progress, they preferred to do nothing. They preferred not to know, and once they knew, they preferred not to care. That's what we heard. Ben made some cute jokes, he gave some illustrations, but underneath their case, what we heard is that they prefer not to care. And we, on the side of the opposition, cannot accept this, because we, as Moses told you, are making a crack in the making a difference. Once they can answer those 2 questions, the proposition can say, had they known, and what had they done, maybe then we can accept what they were done. No, thank you. And then we have this idea of condemnation, which is really, I find, a bit of a tension in their case, because they said the condemnation of Darfur wasn't enough, but what they're going to do is condemn. And we say if one condemnation is enough, then neither is the other. And if so, you guys have to come up with a better plan than condemnation. Especially because, well, Darfur might actually care about a condemnation because they're pretty small and pretty weak. China is huge. China is very strong, very important, and frankly, doesn't care because we've been condemning for years. No, thank you. We've been sitting back and condemning for years. No, thank you. And it really bounced back. It really bounced off this superpower that is called China. We heard about this idea of incentive. That this has to be an incentive. This has to be an incentive. And we're saying, listen, it was an incentive to begin. As we said, beforehand, there really wasn't much. Beforehand, there wasn't much progress, except for Team England sitting there and saying, condemnation, 1 minute, condemnation. There wasn't any progress, and the Olympics really are a catalyst. Yes?
Don't you think that there's kind of a mixed message when we say we really don't like you, have the most economically beneficial international spectre in the universe, you're really bad?
Okay, I'm going to get to the legitimacy in a minute, but I'd like to talk about this idea of what really is better. For example, if I don't like the proposition here, do I get up here and engage with them and discuss with them? Or do I sit in my seat and say, no, I don't want to talk to you, no, I won't talk to you? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And when we're dealing with China, we're not dealing with a 3-year-old who is very clear to them, candy and go to your room. It's a very clear choice. We're dealing with China. We're dealing with a dynamic government. And which is why I'm saying this, it's not black and white. There's not just accepting and condemnation. There's a lot of ground in the middle, no thank you. And we're trying to tread it very carefully. No, thank you. So we said the Olympics were a beginning, and we say this 8 years before, when China's really rickety and saying, wait, are we going to get the Olympics at all? Aren't really a start, because we haven't shown them yet faith. The Olympics happened. Everybody watched. Now the progress begins. And a month later is not enough time. We don't see this as enough time to actually judge the Olympics. As for the progress being made, I personally apologize for the earthquake. It was all my fault, I swear. Really, the earthquake is all they have to say. It didn't happen because there was an earthquake. I'm sorry, it is not really much of a reputation. The fact that there was agreeing to sit down with the Dalai Lama is huge. And saying, brushing off, no thank you, with an earthquake is not enough. And now this issue of legitimacy, because it's clear that this is going to be the core of the debate. And we say like this, we say, we have the air superpower of China. And they're doing a lot of really terrible things, and we accept it. But there's 2 ways to deal with it. It's a way of standing off on the side and pretending they're not part of the international community. But wait a minute, they are, because we deal with them and we talk to them, and Bush has been to China countless times. So we can pretend they're not there and yet pretend they are there at the same time, which is really what the proposition are advocating. Or we can go and have the Olympics there and we say, listen, you're part of the international community. You are. We can't really take you off to a different planet. You're part of this community. We trade with you. We deal with you. Let's talk with you. Let's figure things out. And no, thank you. And the Olympics, being the sign of good faith, being the fact that we have countries in the Olympics who we don't really like. We have a lot of countries with human rights issues in the Olympics, involved in the Olympics, and it doesn't necessarily mean legitimacy. It means this sort of in-between part, between accepting and not liking so much. Maybe we need a new English word for it. I'm not sure. But the fact is that there isn't just legitimacy or nothing. There is a middle ground. That's what we're doing right now. No, thank you. I'd like to now get on to my constructive point, which is about the Olympics. Because we heard the Olympic idea, the holding the Olympic ideas was very important to the proposition. But then they didn't say much about it, and I'm not going to say much about it. Because these were Olympics were, even though it sounds like a 6th grader, were the most amazing Olympics ever. And I know it sounds simplistic, and it sounds a lot like what my little sister would say. But that's a fact, and I'm going to examine this on 2 levels. First, the level of the sports. Because we know the Olympic ideals are of human excellence. They're of sporting events going all the way, and I'll give analysis for that. And then I'll give analysis of the actual events and what that meant for us. So first of all, the sporting events themselves. And the fact was they had a competition on the highest level ever. As we heard from Ben. No, thank you. Usain Bolt with his double record, and Michael Phelps with eight world records and 8 medals. We really pushed the limits. We pushed the limits as far as they are right now. We're going to push them further, because the fact is the sport was on an excellent level. It was the most amazing thing there was yet. And because Olympics are about sports, we can't just disconnect it. So we have to look at the sports, and we realize that really the sporting level was just incredible. But now let's talk about the event, because we heard a lot about the fireworks and a lot about the singers. And the fact is that a new standard was set. And I understand why England are a little bit scared of this. I can understand. 4 years, not enough time to get such a show done. And of course, they can talk about the fireworks, and they can talk about the singer, but all that is really just covering the fact that it was one amazing show. And why is it so important that we enjoy the show? Because the fact is, we're elevating the standards, we're going forward. But then let's discuss the fact that Athens, just 4 years ago, was the lowest viewership ever. And they actually had to use the cameras to film specific parts of the audience, because the audience wasn't full. Because the crowds weren't full. So they filmed only parts where the fans were sitting. Because the Beijing Olympics, the crowds were full. We've gotten the excitement back into the Olympics, yes.
But what China did is pay people to sit in those seats and abuse human rights records in the process.
I don't know if people were paid to sit in the Olympics. Had they been, I'm sorry, I missed it. But the fact is that people all over, as you said yourself, 1.2 billion people watch the Olympics. And as for the human rights, we've told you time and time again, and it hasn't happened. These were happening anyway, and you have no better answer for that than condemnation, no thank you, and condemnation. And we really can't accept this when it's lives at stake, when it's economy at stake, which we said the economy was brought to the people because the government spent the money on the Olympics, but the people were building the building was taking. The people were selling the souvenirs. The people were working there. So we had a government spending and the people earning. And really all these huge benefits that happened were not answered. And quickly to sum up my point, why was it China? Why was China so amazing? Because it was their debut. It was their debut in the international arena because they had to make an impression, because they knew, as we know, and the proposition don't understand, this is just the beginning. I'd like to go over what I've told you today. We first of all told you about the bamboo curtain, which isn't going to just fall over if the proposition just blow hard enough. We really need something a little more sophisticated, a little bit stronger. We need to today that condemnations just don't work. And there aren't just two extremes, legitimacy and nothing. And really there's so much in the middle. And the proposition can't see that. And they really can't see the subtlety of international relations and politics. Because there aren't just two extremes. And I'd like to end with these two questions, which I expect will be answered right now. First of all, who knew? Who knew about the monks? Who knew about Tibet? And last and most important, what have you done? Thank you.
The Olympic torch is a symbol of freedom. In Beijing, it was used to justify imprisonment. A symbol of liberty that was used in order to repress dissent. And a symbol of equality, ladies and gentlemen, which was used to persecute Chinese minorities. Now that might sound like the kind of Olympics that Team Israel think of right here today, ladies and gentlemen. The kind of Olympics whereby the fact that it was a great sporting spectacle can mean that all of these things can be completely ignored. But what we believe today on the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, was that the Olympic torch illuminated the stadium whilst it darkened the brutality. It showed China's best sides, whilst it hid and let fester China's worst sides. And we've shown you that today with three things. We've explained to you exactly why we believe that the Beijing Olympics undermine the Olympic ideal, why we believe they undermine human rights, and why we believe that they've legitimised China's brutality. What I'm going to do today in my speech is look at the three main objections we've heard from Team Israel. I'm going to be looking firstly about whether this has done anything for good for human rights now. I'm going to be looking at whether this will do anything good for human rights in the future. And I'm then going to be mopping up a lot of what we heard in the previous speech about everything it's done great for the Olympic Games. So let's immediately start looking at the first of these. Let's look at exactly what the Beijing Olympics has done for human rights. Because what Emily stood up and told you here immediately today, ladies and gentlemen, and something Team Israel have ignored, is that we didn't give China the Olympics in order that they merely provide a fantastic spectacle. We said, provide us with a great show, and we're doing this because we want you to improve your human rights record by the time we get to Beijing in 2008, ladies and gentlemen. That was 8 years ago, and that's why we say the fact that there has been no improvement after 8 years isn't good enough. It isn't that the Olympics happened 2 months ago, ladies and gentlemen. It's that they were given the bid 8 years ago and have done absolutely nothing to improve their position. No thank you. What we told you about, ladies and gentlemen, immediately was the fact that China have continued to do the things that we think are awful. They've continued organ harvesting. They've continued executions. They've continued, ladies and gentlemen, to violate free speech. And we heard 3 glimmers of hope from Israel, ladies and gentlemen. 3 fantastic things that happened. Firstly, they were prepared to talk to the Dalai Lama whilst not recognising Tibetan independence and never wanting to reorganise that meeting after a hurricane, after an earthquake took place. No, thank you. We heard all the great things it did for, like, pollution in Beijing, ladies and gentlemen, when the Chinese authorities didn't let anyone drive for 2 weeks, so the marathon runners could just about get to the finish line without dying, and now they're very happy to let everyone drive their cars again and continue polluting the environment. Their other glimmer of hope, ladies and gentlemen, was that China were prepared to let a condemnation of massacre in Sudan happen. Not stop massacre, ladies and gentlemen. They were prepared to allow people to say it was bad, no thank you, whilst changing absolutely nothing about Chinese policy in that country, or in Burma, or in Tibet, or in any other country. And what you need to do today is weigh that up, ladies and gentlemen. Weigh that up against the fact, something we told you, something which was ignored, which was that these Olympic Games have been used to justify and have led to more persecution and repression than before. Isn't it just that it didn't get better when we were told it would get better? It's that it got worse, ladies and gentlemen. It's that Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang were persecuted in the name of a fabricated terrorist threat against those Olympics, and that persecution was allowed to take place. It was that people were told they could protest, and then if they failed for a protest, ladies and gentlemen, they were sent for re-education. It was that, ladies and gentlemen, we were told by Israel today how this is going to do great things for the economy, but people's houses were bulldozed and they don't have anywhere to live. Things got worse, they didn't get better.
You seem very happy to brush off all the advancements we've shown you with a wave of your hand, but we have to ask, would have refusing China's formularies, would have ignoring them done any?
Well, this really nicely leads me on to what I'm saying in my second point about the future of human rights, ladies and gentlemen, because we were challenged today about a middle ground between condemnation and acceptance. And we say that they aren't condemning at all and are only accepting. And what we stand for, and what we told you immediately in Emily's speech, was that we believe that the Olympic Games should have been given on the condition that Chinese human rights improved. That firstly fulfills everything they want about talking, about cooperating, about helping China improve, no thank you. It recognises China's awesome potential, ladies and gentlemen, that we believe they're a potential world player, that we recognise they can make a great human games. But what it also does is says we are not prepared as an international community to condone the atrocious things that you as a country commit. And we will give you the human games after you change that, and not on the hope that you will. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the middle ground that they seek, and that's the middle ground that falls straight onto our proposition that we've told you about consistently, and that Team Israel have failed to recognise.
Sir.
No, thank you. We also had these 2 challenges. Did anyone before? No. And we say, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, they knew. People knew about Tiananmen Square. The human rights protests that we've been hearing about are from human rights groups that have been protesting against China for years and years and years, ladies and gentlemen. People did know. But the people who will be impressed by the Olympic Games are the billions of people who watched the opening ceremony and only saw China's awesome mightiness or something. The people, ladies and gentlemen, that only saw China's handsome face whilst its ugly face was festering in the background. And we say that's the damage, because people that knew about it before still know about it, and they condemn the Olympic Games for having taken place in China. And anyone who didn't know about it before just saw an amazing show. Except
the fact is, you couldn't have all these statistics if you didn't know. This raising...
Well, I'm actually very learned, madam. I read the newspaper. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that what people saw when they saw the Olympic Games, ladies and gentlemen, was a fantastic show. The show we heard so much about, all the benefits that we heard so much about, and that's what Israel clearly remembered by the Olympic Games. That's pretty what most people remember by the Olympic Games, ladies and gentlemen, because how many of you heard of the persecution happening to Uyghur Muslims on the front page of your newspaper the day after the Olympic ceremony took place? I certainly didn't read about it. And then, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, the second question was what would have been done. We have our point, ladies and gentlemen, today about using the Olympics as a bargaining chip, not giving China the Olympic Games before they actually change their human rights message. And we also heard a tension in Israel's case, because at first we heard, who knew about the Olympic Games, who knew about these human rights abuses before. And then we heard, ladies and gentlemen, about all the condemnation that's taken place over years and years and years and years. No, thank you. Those two pieces of analysis emerged in 2 different points, and we'd like to hear Israel try to reconcile those. So now let's look at the third, ladies and gentlemen, a rather less important issue, we believe, when compared to human rights abuse, of the Olympics as a spectacle. And we had 2 parts here. Firstly, the sport was great. Well, Usain Bolt, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't run faster because he was in Beijing with the polluted air. The man can run. He would have run just as fast, if the games were in London. I'm sure he will. I'm sure he'll embarrass Team Great Britain just like we always get embarrassed. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, the sport as a competition, as a spectacle, would have been great wherever it was. And we then had the idea about setting a new standard. We say we think it's awful that that's what Team Israel remember from China. A new standard in the Olympic Games, ladies and gentlemen. A new level to be raced to, because we think China slumped. We think China slumped when they started to use the Olympics. The Olympics that Emily told you were a symbol of international cooperation and peace. We think China slumped when they used those to justify human rights abuses, ladies and gentlemen. So we don't want China to have set a new standard for the Olympics as a spectacle. We want China to be remembered for having the brutal and ugly face that it has. So for all of these reasons, I proudly today stand on Team England, and I regret the Olympic Games having taken place in
A lot has been bandied about in today's debate, and I feel I'm sufficiently involved to really, address everything except for Ben's dream about men in swimming wear. What we have to say here is that we're talking about regret. Meaning, on that hand, we have to say, look, there were good things that happened, but there were bad things that happened. Let's really look and see the equation. Team Israel said this, look, bad things, good things. Let's measure them up. Let's see who did a better job. Now, here's what happened. They pretty much didn't address any of the good things that happened. They just said, well, they happened, but I mean, like, a historical meeting between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese thing, which was put off, yes, because of an earthquake, and now negotiations are going in to set it up again. That means nothing from a country which has denied that Tibet has ever existed, which has refused to allow the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet. Of course, that means nothing, ladies and gentlemen, because the fact is, big benefits were put in in the Olympics, and the fact is, let's see if their harm really actually outweighed them. So the first question I'm going to ask is, does the Olympics grant, 100% illegitimacy, a kosher stamp on China today? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we're all Jews here. Made human rights work. This is what they said. They actually made human rights work. I'm going to address this. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, did our plan actually improve the situation in China, and will it continue to improve in the future? Or will the international community, going back to what it did in the 70s and just ignoring China and leaving it alone to stew in its own mess, whether that was really helpful, because that's what they want us to go back to. So does holding the Olympics grant 100% legitimacy? So the first thing we heard was, well, we let Nazi hold it, and we let the communism hold it, and we see how legitimate everyone thought their ideas were. Which is funny, because we went to war with the Nazis a few short years after letting them hold it, regardless of the fact that apparently we now legitimize them completely. We continue to, actually fight with China, not direct war, because we don't want global destruction, but, through the Cold War, while this was going on. The fact that they held the Olympics in the meantime doesn't suddenly mean that they're 100% legitimate. And it never means that, ladies and gentlemen. People participate in the Olympics with one another. Iran and Israel participate in the Olympics with one another together. Neither of them really actually recognize each other so much. This doesn't matter. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we don't see this as giving legitimacy. No government in the world really sees, no thank you, that the Olympics is legitimized. If you participate in the Olympics, therefore you are a great guy, go you. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we heard, no thanks, a limited analysis on this side about why it does. And they said, well, first of all, because Bush was there clapping, and second of all, ladies and gentlemen, because it was distraction, because everyone only remembers the fireworks. So, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that Bush was there, Bush is in and out of China quite a lot. Because here's the thing, we still have all kinds of trade that goes on with China, like in the economic sphere. We still have all actually military trade going on with China between countries, between the US and China, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is, Bush goes there all the time, and we do have some kind of trade there, because he's actually trying to help out this kind of rather bad situation. 1 second, sir. The fact that Bush is there, though, doesn't mean that everyone in America thinks that China is great.
Yeah, but the fact that every world leader was there, and that China was hosting the event and not participating in the event, makes China a leader.
Alright, thank you. But ladies and gentlemen, here's the thing. The fact that I hosted the competition, the fact that members of state were there, again, this doesn't legitimize what I do. This doesn't legitimize my actions. It means, ladies and gentlemen, that I was given to participate in the international arena. And ladies and gentlemen, no one here, and nobody in the world, except for Team England, seems to think that China shouldn't be involved in the international arena. It doesn't make that you legitimize everything you do. However, no one thinks that just sitting there and condemning China has any effect at all, just like they don't think that sitting there and condemning Darfur has any effect at all, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. But now for the distraction. Well, here's the thing. I don't really believe this at all, because they got up here and said, well, no one remembers anything about Tibet. But here's the thing, China has become a huge issue in the presidential elections, ladies and gentlemen, a few months after the Olympics happened, because people still care about what's going on, because people still know about what's going on, because people don't have the memory of a goldfish, and they're not distracted by pretty lights. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact is, people still care about these issues. People care about people starving, people care about these human rights issues. Yes, they're happening. Let's deal with them. They would have happened anyway. No, thank you. Now we know about it. And now not just Team England, the top debaters in the country, know about these problems, but everybody in the world knows about the problems, ladies and gentlemen. It was absolutely, no, thank you. Absolutely everywhere. So, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't legitimize what they're doing. And will give more legitimacy, I would say, is just sitting by and saying, I'm not listening, I'm going to pretend you're not there. No, thank you. I'm not going to let you be involved in the international community. This doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't no, thank you. This just doesn't do anything. So, did it make human rights worse? Well, let's talk about the fact that there's two kinds of things that we could have done. We could have just, condemned them, as they said, which we did for many, many years, no thank you, during the 70s, where we just let China alone and didn't interact with all. And what happened? Huge human rights abuse. Or we could, let's say, do what they did, ladies and gentlemen, and say, well, we're going to talk to them, but we're not going to give them the Olympics, and no one's really going to know about what's happening there. No thank you. But no, ladies and gentlemen, the human rights didn't get worse because the Olympics was held there. There was a lot of progress made in these human rights abuse. Lots of people got helped out by this. It didn't solve the entire problem. It's the start of a progress. We gave you many examples of how people were actually helped out. They never actually addressed these. No thank you. And then, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about direct abuse. So, first of all, I don't think that anyone in the world actually thought that when China went to hold the elections, they would actually hold the Olympics, every single stipulation set by on the international document would be held by. I don't think the international community is as naive as Team England here, ladies and gentlemen. I think that they know that there is, no thank you, a bit of give and take with what goes on in the international community. And I don't think they thought everything followed, one second, to the letter. Yeah.
You still haven't addressed what we said, which is we should have used it as a bargaining chip, and that's the middle ground.
Okay, but ladies and gentlemen, here's the point, and I'll get to that in a second. You know what, actually, I'll get to that in a really half second, because the other abuse that they said, people being moved from their houses, they were moved from their houses and given new houses, ladies and gentlemen. They weren't left homeless. And here's the thing, well, we let democratic countries rezone areas as well. This was on a wider scale, but it wasn't like shocking human rights abuse. And as for the Muslims, well, first of all, a lot of countries like, kind of persecute Muslims today. It should be so bad. And ladies and gentlemen, the problem is, again, this happened anyway. This was happening anyway. So will ours improve? They say, ladies and gentlemen, that if we just held it over their head, you can have the Olympics when you jump through every single little hoop, then China would have done something. No, ladies and gentlemen, China doesn't trust the West so much. Mostly because the West has kind of not been so fair with it in the international arena before. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we gave them the carrot for a bit. We still have the stick, which is, hey, we won't trade with you. Hey, we won't do any kind of military tie with you. We won't let you be involved in the international community. There's still another huge bargaining chip. But yeah, we had to throw them something. They had to actually get something in order to trust it to begin with. This was the beginning of a process. And just saying, you can have it, like when we fill in every single bit of this little document over here, ladies and gentlemen, isn't enough for China. It's not enough for any rational human being if they don't trust people. We gave that first level of trust to China to help out the international community. Now they're more involved in the international community, even a month later, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the point. Holding the Olympics didn't give them legitimacy. It didn't make human rights work, but there's no real harms, and it had huge amounts of benefit of getting them involved and actually solving certain human rights abuse. We win. Thank you.
Okay, just to warn you, I'm not going to be making any jokes in my speech. I'm not the funny one. Ben is the funny one. I'm just the pretty one. So. Alright, so let's start right away. In order to win this debate, the proposition had to prove that they regret the Olympics. And what does that word mean? That's a very interesting word. What can we understand from that? So, basically what they set out is that they were going to prove that the Olympics caused more harm than good. And we also stressed that they had to prove that the harm that did occur wouldn't have happened anyway, irregardless of the Olympics. Also, they had to prove, in order to win this debate, that there was a better option. That somehow not holding the Olympics in Beijing would have done more good than the fact that the Olympics were held there. And I'm going to go over this burden of proof step by step and show you why they did not stand up to it. First, I'll be discussing the harms that they presented that the Olympics apparently caused. Then I'll be discussing the question of did the Olympics actually achieve anything or not. Finally, I'll move on to the better option idea. So let's start right away with the harms that they presented that the Olympics caused. Now, the main harm that they came back to again and again was legitimizing China's abuses, showing China's good side and somehow thereby declaring that China was a perfect nation that we accept without.
So, and what we've said again and again throughout the debate about this point is that allowing China to participate in the international community is recognizing them. And that's not the same as legitimizing them. Recognizing that China is there, China is a country, it has a couple billion people in it, that the Chinese government has sovereignty, the Chinese government does have independence, and that they do have problems. We're saying we want to deal with you, we want to negotiate with you, we want to interact with you. We're not simply standing by on the side and saying, well, you know, you're doing bad things, therefore we're not going to talk to you. And the way they attempted to prove legitimacy was saying people saw the opening ceremony and they immediately came to the conclusion that China is perfect. But ladies and gentlemen, what we came back to again and again is that right after the opening ceremony, they changed the channel to the news and heard about the abuses in Tibet. They changed the channel and heard about the monks being massacred. The Olympics brought a whole new level of international awareness to China's abuses, and we believe that's a step down the road to changing the problems. Now, moving on to the question of whether the Olympics achieved anything or not, because they attempted to brush off the Olympics achievements with a wave of their hands. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not that easy. The Olympics brought about great environmental and economic improvements to the Chinese nation. The huge cutbacks in pollution may have been achieved using the wrong means. China isn't perfect yet, but they were significant. People's health is going to be better. And also the economic improvements which they ignored, these are vitally important. People who would have starved now had money to feed their children. This is a very important issue. And also, perhaps the more significant improvements were the improvements in international relations. We gave you the examples of the charter flights to Taiwan. We gave you the example of the meeting with the Dalai Lama, a historical occurrence. We gave you the example of the Security Council. And beyond even these examples, there are things that can't be measured. There's subtle improvements in trust, in interdependence, in the vast tapestry that we call international relations. And once again, we come back to the issue of raised awareness to China's harms. But then at the end of the day, what really this debate comes down to is the question of whether not holding the Olympics would have been better. Because otherwise, there's no reason to regret it. And the proposition told us again and again, we shouldn't have held the Olympics. Instead, we should have promised that we would have held the Olympics, and in the meanwhile, condemn. But ladies and gentlemen, we say it's not that easy. You can't treat China like a child. You can't send them off and say, come back once you become a wonderful utopia. It doesn't work that way. We need to engage with China. We need to reach out to them. And disrespecting them, denying them the respect that they feel that they deserve, ignoring them, refusing to deal with them, and simply condemning them day in and day out is not going to help the people of China. Thank you very much.
10 and 1.2 billion people watching at home. We'd have had rather higher expectations than a couple of world records. And, ladies and gentlemen, a meeting that never happened. Because that's what Israel had come to you with today, ladies and gentlemen, a meeting that never happened, and a really cool show. Well, Team England, ladies and gentlemen, would have expected better. We'd have expected better from the Olympic idea. And that's what we told you from the very beginning of our case today. That we regret the Beijing Olympics because they didn't live up to their potential to change China, and they didn't live up to the Olympic ideal. So first of all, let's look at the Olympic ideal, ladies and gentlemen. Because what we told you on this side of the house is that it is an event about peace. It is an event about global cooperation, and it's supposed to be an event about freedom. Now their response to this, ladies and gentlemen, was nobody really thought China was going to become free when we gave it to them. That would be silly. That would be naive. No, ladies and gentlemen, this could have been an enormously powerful tool for political change. And the only other thing they came to you with, ladies and gentlemen, was that sport was great. Now Team England have never sought to deny that Michael Phelps broke 8 world records, ladies and gentlemen, but our Team Israel seriously hanging their case as to what the Olympic ideal means on the fact that it was more important that Usain Bolt ran really fast in the bird's nest than that we prevented massacres in Tibet, that we stopped torture by the Chinese secret police. We accept the sport was really good, ladies and gentlemen, but we'd have liked a little more. So on to my next point, ladies and gentlemen. What would we have liked, and have things got better? Now Team Israel completely ignored what we told you from the very beginning, ladies and gentlemen, that China has already had 9 years since we gave them the bit to make progress, and they've done nothing. They came to you with the example of the meeting that never happened, and said, oh well, there was an earthquake. We say, even if the meeting does happen now, it's not as though they've stopped massacring Tibetans. It's not as though they've changed their policies on execution and torture. If they want to example horse trade, ladies and gentlemen, then they failed to come back on our examples of live organ harvesting. They've never answered the fact that China is executing more and more people year on year, not fewer and fewer, that more and more political prisoners are languishing in Chinese jails, ladies and gentlemen, not to mention the fact that the people whose homes were taken away didn't get new ones. Their only other excuse was that loads of countries abuse Muslims. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but we demand a bit better than that, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that's an excuse. But now will they get better? Now they tried to paint us as a bit simplistic, ladies and gentlemen. They said, Team England think there's only condemnation and acceptance. Except, we told you in our first speech that we didn't think that at all. We thought there was a really good middle ground, which was an incentive. Which was saying, we think you're disgusting, we think you're abhorrent, and we'd like you to change. And when you do, we'll give you what you want, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we wanted out of these Olympics. That's how we sought to get China into the international community. We don't think they're not part of it, ladies and gentlemen, but we say that they need to be a better part of it. And they try to mischaracterize that, ladies and gentlemen. There's a big difference between accepting that we have to trade with you a bit and bringing the biggest show in town to your capital city. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, what do people remember? Well, we might remember Tibet. We had to learn about it for world schools. But the 2 billion people that watched the Olympics on TV, ladies and gentlemen, remembered what their second speaker remembered. A really good show. And we'd have liked better, and thus we beg to propose.
And it's my pleasure to represent the panel and to give you the brief adjudication speech for what I'm sure you all agree with us was a fantastically spirited debate. Provocative, it's engaging, it's good-natured, and it gets down to clash. And that's why audiences come and watch debates, and it's sometimes better than football or soccer. I think that where the clash of ideas was concerned, and where the development, rebuttal, and argumentation was concerned, and where this whole notion of the flow of action was concerned, down the table, that's where the judges looked at the nature and the evolution of this debate. So let's talk about the nature of the analysis. Now, what we wanted to see in a high-level debate where the issue was clearly out there for all of us to look at, where there were no definitional clearly, the simple, clear axioms of debate were out there. What we wanted to see was robust analysis. So let's talk about this nature of robust analysis. So what we wanted to look at was not just quantitative presentations of facts, we wanted qualitative analysis. And I think both teams gave us a strong attempt to engage each other by looking at the quality of what the other team was using to construct the foundation of their particular case. And then this qualitative analysis is what we looked at to see which team better managed its content in order to create a debate that had clear line of action. Now we felt where this debate was concerned, both teams in this instance were as admirable as each other because they both had good points to make. On the one hand about illegitimacy, on the other hand the notion that had to do about the progress that you can accept from China and where we could go from here. So there was really nothing that we could say that we found that separated the teams in terms of that. So qualitatively, we liked what was going on because qualitatively we were having the presentations which were meaningful and robust. Now that then took us to this whole notion of the flow of the debate. And the flow of the debate is where we look at what does each team have to do in relation to their responsibilities, either as the government or the negative. We looked at what each team needed to do in order to persuade us that they were fulfilling their role within the context of the debate. So we looked at what the proposition actually set up, what the opposition actually said, and we considered the notions of the nuances, whether or not there was actually a status quo that we were returning to, whether or not there was actually some kind of middle ground that was being created, what exactly was happening. And we were looking not just for what was said at first proposition or first opposition, but we were looking at the flow. As we went down the table, what were the kinds of analysis that was taking place in relation to the initial setups, and what was the way in which each team was able to provide us with layers of sophisticated assessment of each other's responses to that initial setup, fulfilling either role as proposition or either role as opposition. So you can see, complex debate with back and forth action, which then took us, as you can see, we were really close, we were watching the debate with care, it then had to come down to the next element that every debate judge looks at, and that's the notion of rebuttal. At rebuttal, we were looking to see whether enough weight was being placed by either team on the issue and the kind of ramifications that the issue generated, as opposed to perhaps sidestepping the issue or using humor as an alternative to analysis. Now, I'm going to say to you, we loved this debate. It was funny. It was fantastic because people were affable. You could look at them and say, my God, you're not a nerd. You're actually quite interesting. Adjudication also involves this idea of looking for rebuttal that goes to the heart of the issue, placing serious weight where it's due, using the humor to accentuate rebuttal, and then persuading us where the core issues felt that one side as opposed to the other managed to tango, and to then shift that debate such that what we had was progressively an onward march where one side was gaining more ground over the other in terms of where the issues fell and whose issues were principally being argued down the table. Now, taking all these into concern, this was not a unanimous decision. We felt that this debate, in the end, on a 4-1 decision, was given to England.